here in, here in Budapest, and I'm also an external PhD candidate at the University of Manchester. My main field of research is scientometrics, or quantitative social sciences, and network analysis. That's probably my strongest suit. And Martin asked me to talk about this paper that he and his colleagues in the lab published recently in COME, which is a Q2 journal in communications and communication sciences. So that's what I will be talking about mainly. I did take part in some way, especially with the data analysis. But in fact, AI and academic knowledge production is one of my key research areas that I'm focusing on. And if you check my publication record, you can see that I did publish a few papers on it just recently. So um, what Martin asked me to do is to introduce this entire issue with more general statements. I do suppose that given Poznan universities and this particular research labs focus, this will not be a big surprise to see as to the case of Western academic culture being overly representative of what we constitute as academic knowledge production right now. And the paper itself, which is rather long and structured in a way that introduces the notion of AI, but not specifically analyzes or examines how AI is being implemented in the specific research. It is rather illustrative of what AI can do in terms of future knowledge production. It is important first to underline that still, if you look at all scientometric papers today, and I do see this trend in my work as well, especially in the papers published in the leading social scientific journals that deal with scientometrics, Scientometrics, Journal of Informatics, GASISD, all the other big names. We are talking about exactly the same things, which is that the Western, especially the Anglo-Saxon periphery pardon, core nations are still prevalent and overly dominant in the field of knowledge production. And we can also see that peripheral actors, Marton uses peripheral actors for Germany and France. I do disagree with him on this. I do believe that Germany and France and the Netherlands are core actors. This is a key argument that I and him have. Still, we can see that the semi-peripheral region, let's put it this way, Western European nations, Canada, and even China are very prevalent in knowledge production. And all the other countries, the 100 plus countries that are present in academic knowledge production, are marginalized or on the very periphery of academic knowledge production. Marton, in his paper, which can be accessed, let's here, if you look at it, but I can send it to you if you want to, or I can just share it once I end my presentation. He traces back, given his work in 2020 and before 2020, and also the work of Wallerstein back in 2004, I believe, is that there are five key components as to what makes this problem of core periphery so problematic in academic knowledge production. I do have to underline that Martin uses Wallerstein's framework. I do propose that Wallerstein is a bit, let's put it this way, conservative with his categorization. I do prefer Collins' 1998 proposal that there is a possibility for the periphery to break into the core, as opposed to what Wallerstein proposes. Still, let's stick with Martin's framework, who says that the first key issue is language. Given the current audience and the current framework that I'm presenting in, I do suppose that this is not a big issue or not a big surprise for you all as well. Publishing in Hungarian and I suppose publishing in Polish is practically non-existent in the international academic knowledge production sphere. When we are publishing in Hungarian or when you are publishing in Polish, I suppose that's for a local audience. However, it does cause the loss of epistemic knowledge. And we do acknowledge that, especially in regions when linguistic difficulties are so prevalent and prominent, such as in Hungary, for example, this does create a divide between what international academic knowledge producers count as knowledge or academia, and what us as local Hungarians count as academic knowledge production um, and academia. Naturally, it's long time. Martin's been working overtime on Latin America and the Hispano-Latin context. Um, I do have to underline that despite what Marton achieves with his research, and it was supported by Manuel Goyanes as well, more famously Homero Zuniga de Gil and other Spanish scholars, um, the fact that the Hispano-Latin context is emerging so fast and so rapidly is probably because of the fact that they are huge in population and they have an interconnected and synchronized linguistic sphere as well. This creates a bigger divide in terms of what we understand as the linguistic problems. Just put it this way, Hungarian, for example, has absolutely zero connection to other languages except for maybe Finnish, therefore creating a shared space of academic knowledge production sphere is practically impossible for us. Second of all, I do suppose that you are well familiar with the problem with publishers. Not only the fact that there is an extreme overconcentration in the West, just look at SciMago for example, you will not see any Eastern European or Chinese or Latin American papers in the top 100 in any subject category, practically. These are all UK, US, Dutch, German, and sometimes a few Spanish papers or journals that are that are presented there. And my particular work, especially last year, focused on publishers and the publication patterns with regard to publishers. And what we can see is that the big five, Wiley, Taylor, Francis, Sage, Elsevier, and which was the last one? Taylor, yeah, Springer, sorry. But even the new or more controversial ones, for example, MDPI and Frontiers, they're doing exactly the same thing. These are highly competitive journals on paper. In practice, not so much. They are publishing more and more. There's an exponential growth in publication count, which is very worrying if you think about it, given that these, for example, Nature used to be a very competitive journal. Now it publishes I don't know if you know this, but more than 15,000 articles a single year. That's an egregious number for such a prestigious journal. And the same is happening with all big five publishers. What we are seeing, and I think Martin is right to call this out, is that the West is essentially going for a highly capitalistic, uh, exclusively for-profit publication system where you're nothing but the guy who pays the open access. Naturally, we can trace it back to economic and developmental issues. I think this is the more conventional or more comfortable argument that one could make, and the Matthew effect as well, so the rich get richer. However, what I think Martin and his colleagues did especially right in this particular research is tracing back the epistemic discrepancies to the open access movement. Now, I have worked or I have talked with and discussed issues with Mikhail Laxo, who works at the University of Tampere. I think he's one of the best scholars to ever touch on this topic. And especially here in the semi-periphery of Europe, but I do suppose that Hungary has become a peripheral country in Europe. We do look at open access and the open access movement as some sort of magical thing that is happening in academic knowledge production. And it's certainly good. If you look at the empirical data, which is highly focused on correlation, which is super important, not causality, you can see that open access papers are cited more, they are viewed more, they are visited more, consulted more. The cause are to be traced back once again to the uneven distribution of funds and epistemic knowledge as a whole. Demeter and his colleagues have published an excellent paper on this in 2020 that looks at the difficulties with open access publishing outside what we call as the core countries, so key European countries, the US and the UK. There are high APC fees. It is not guaranteed that all open access will be covered by your institution. And many research and qualitative research does support this, show that Eastern European scholars are highly anxious about paying these fees as opposed to Western colleagues. To think of your work, for example, I can think of mine illustratively. Paying 2,000 euros out of pocket is practically impossible given the funds and wages in this region. It is not it is not that egregious, for example, at the University of Manchester, where I also work. So this is also something to take into account. And these are just a few things, the bigger things that we can look at. Of course, there are all more contextual things, discipline-specific things. But this was the theoretical framework and the premise of what the material worked at. And what he did and his colleagues touched on, not empirically, I would say, but in a more epistemic or philosophical way, is whether AI can change the current trends in academic knowledge production. Now, there are of course different models. If you look at Western use and the Western policies on AI, you can see great discrepancies. And this is something that I've been working on for the last 6 months, looking at policies, looking at different research, looking at what Western publishers are saying about AI. And what I've discovered thus far, and what Demeter discovered as well, is that there are huge discrepancies as to how and why AI can or cannot be used. The only thing that virtually all publishers and all journals agree on is that AI cannot be accounted in authorship, cannot be assigned to an author to have an authorship status or position. However, for example, the Chinese model is vastly different. If you look at the CNKI, which is a Chinese version of, I would say, Scopus or WOS, and some Chinese journals, if you have access to CNKI, we were lucky enough to have a pilot access for 1 month. The AI policies are very different. For example, they encourage AI use in some way, given that there are the linguistic problems that we face as peripheral scholars can be overcome in some way, still not without any problems or errors, but with actual good prompt engineering, these issues can be overcome. And the Chinese model does suppose that you shall use AI if it ameliorates or develops your research, as opposed to the Western one, or the Western one in a way that the UK, US, and other publishers' philosophy, they highly discourage you to ever use AI in research. Just look at any policy published by a journal at Springer or published by a journal at Sage. All of the policies say that you should not credit AI to this and that. You should not use AI for this and that, and you may use it for linguistic checks. But let's be honest, truly, everyone uses AI in some way, shape, or form right now. The the very number of papers after ChatGPT was introduced in late 2023 has doubled, and it had already an exponential growth. We can lie to ourselves that no one is using AI in research, but that's not the truth. And that's not for linguistic checks only. I've seen papers where the entire paper has been generated from figures to tables to even formulas and models, which was interesting to me, given that in quantitative social sciences, and what I've been trained on is that you should never trust anything with formulas except for your supervisor. Still, people are generating entire models with this thing and this tool. So the question becomes, is the West going into the right direction or is it not? And it is also a question of whether we can compare really these two models given the epistemic bias and training data. We know nothing about the Chinese models in terms of training data. We have a few sources, but we do know that there is a strong bias. However, we must underline that there is a strong bias, especially training bias, with regard to Western models as well. Just think of Gemini, Perplexity, or ChatGPT to name the more popular ones. So the research and the results are mentioned in this paper published in Coma. It's titled Parallel Empires of Knowledge, AI and the Fracturing of Global Science. And it was authored by the lab here. And a few things, just so you can see the background. So this paper worked with a large data set or larger data set of more than, I would say, 30 million data points, if I remember correctly. And it analyzed using Simago and Scopus the entire publication trend of what is mentioned in Scopus. Naturally, it has limits, and it is mentioned in the paper as well. Focusing solely on Scopus does have huge limitations, linguistic limitations to document type limitations to all the other stuff. However, what we did is essentially um, differentiate between different countries and focusing on countries as a meso level analysis and on a macro level on certain specific regions that we assigned the countries to and see how from 1996 to 2024, which was the last year that we had full access data for, how trends have changed. We focused on the big three specifically, which is the United States, the United Kingdom, and China. However, I do have to underline that the entire paper focuses on 20 countries max. And this is because of Barabashi's long tail or power law statement as well, which was mentioned in Wang and Barabashi in 2021, which is that knowledge production is highly skewed. So when we are talking about knowledge production or academic knowledge production from a global standpoint, we're essentially focusing on 20 to 25 countries and not 119 or 92. The long tail comes from the fact that the other 170 countries are practically non-existent compared to the big ones. So that's a key limitation as well. Here we can see the assignments of what we counted as specific parts and regions that we focused on. And what we looked at more qualitatively is generative AI and what it can do to change trends. This, for example, is knowledge map I developed last year. It was published this year. Is about how ChatGPT is used in research from a network analysis standpoint. If you want to, you can read it in the Journal of Empirical and Human Research, a Q1 journal published by Sage. I think it's a scientometric assessment of ChatGPT in academic knowledge production or something like that. I'm not quite sure of the title. Anyway, the analyzed trends were publication records, international collaboration. We used data from Scopus, Scival when we had it, and Simago and open access. So these are the three main things that we focused on. A few descriptive stats. If you are focusing on the big ones, you can see that something interesting is happening. Um, the citations are natural in a sense that given that we did the analysis in 2025, naturally the citation counts are falling behind in the more recent years. I think the more important and the more interesting, or rather intriguing stuff is the count of documents. If you look at the trends, you can see that the US and the United Kingdom is doing rather steady exponential growth. It's not too fast, but it's rather steady. However, China has changed the game in some way. If you look at 2014, for example, it seemed to peak and fall behind, and something happens in 2015 and practically there is zero literature as to what it can be. And the publication count booms in Scopus with regard to China. I do have to mention, though, that me and Peter Shashvari also did a research on retractions, and the same pattern can be seen as well. So something in the middle of the 2010s, in the 2010s in China, has changed the landscape of academic knowledge production. They are bombing out papers. They are bombing out bad papers as well because they have the most retracted articles in the entire world. Still, they seem to be dominating the field of academic knowledge production, and it does not seem to slow down anytime soon. If you look at international collaborations, however, you can see that they are not hugely collaborative with other countries. Um, the rate that falls at just a bit more than 18% is extremely low if you think about it. Compared to the UK or or the United States, the UK has an international collaboration rate closing in on, I think it was 62.8% compared to 18% international collaboration rates. This means that China has created its own ecosystem where they are incredibly productive. They can publish in international Western journals. They are indexed in the Western scopus, but they are not collaborating too much with non-Western scholars. Um, this was predicted in some way by Demeter in 2020 when he proposed that China will be a new epistemic center of knowledge production. However, I do not think that he could have predicted that it would become the center so fast, given that in just 10 years, China has changed the entire landscape of academic knowledge production. The open access rates are not drastic and they are following the same patterns. It's interesting how after COVID, for whatever reason, open access rates are falling behind. There are some quantitative or empirical qualitative research and as to why, for example, funding is being cut back at a large number of universities, not just in the periphery, but in the West as well. I do experience it in the UK as well. That may be one cause, but practically no one really knows as to why open access is falling behind, especially when open access publishing is with regard to even preprints and all the other journal options is becoming more and more popular on paper. I think more or a more long-term analysis would be needed to have a better assessment on this one. And when we look at Asia and Europe, two important things to consider is that the European countries are following the exact same pattern. If you look at the big five, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, and the Netherlands, it's practically indistinguishable as to how similar the trends are in terms of international collaboration, for example. It's not the case for Asia, and research and literature is rather scarce on why international collaboration rates are fluctuating in Asia all the time. But if you look at the general results from 2024, you can see that international collaboration rates are still rather low, except for Japan and except for Indonesia, which shows a very weird fluctuation starting from 2022 until 2012 to 2022. They stay under 40% most of the time, as opposed to the European giants, which tend to fall between 24 to 60%. Um, so what we did is an ARIMA analysis. Um, we did have not a conflict, but a discussion as to whether ARIMA can be used for such research. ARIMA is a predictive model. It is used in statistics, and it's very time sensitive and context sensitive as well. So the one key limitation with ARIMA and its use in this particular research is that if we were to have more context and more factors and more perimeters, the army would be even better in predicting future trends. However, we fit at a Bayesian model and it showed a rather okayish or significant and publishable model and robustness. So we deemed that it would be possible to use ARIMA. ARIMA is a highly sophisticated model. Again, it is used, for example, in tracking collaboration patterns on a smaller scale and even a larger scale if you look at universities. However, they usually take into account at least 5 or 10 factors. We were using essentially 3 plus 2 factors if we take into account the meso and macro level statistics of countries and regions as well. The ARIMA model tells us that if the trends do not change, and if we freeze time right now, the rates of international collaborations will skyrocket with regard to the UK, stay the same with regard to the US, and stagnate with China as well. I think the more important result is that we had is with regard to China and publication counts. If we look at the historical data and if we forecast it to just 5 years, which is not a lot of time, we can see that China will skyrocket and rose to the very top of academic knowledge production purely on quantitative measures, while the US and the UK will likely follow the same structure and a very slow growing rate in the coming future. Naturally, we cannot discredit whether there would be a plateauing effect. By plateauing effect, I'm using the term as maximum capacity as to what one particular country can produce. It is very well possible that the US is approaching this and the UK as well. The predictive model tells us that it's very far away from the plateau for China right now. Again, these are just 5 years, so we're still not closing in on what we can see in 100 years, for example, and I do not think any predictive model can do that. Still, what Demeter is trying to say and his colleagues is that after with the introduction of AI and generative AI, more research has to be done as to how AI is being used in particular research segments because publication counts are this booming are highly unusual for any country, especially for a country such a big size and such well documented. Something is definitely happening, and the West is not following the same patterns. Whether it will be a good or bad thing, history will decide. However, looking at the empirical data, something is not quite adding up. So the conclusions of the paper, and I think I'll end this presentation here, is that the publication trends are showing fluxes but are no longer representative of what we understood as the great discrepancies and the great divides of academic knowledge production. Just look at Demeter's 2020 book, seminal book, Academic Knowledge Production in the Global South, where he proposes that we should divide the entire world into a few categories: core, semi-periphery, periphery. And then Demeter did not take China as a core actor. Now, if you look at the data itself, you can see that China is probably what will be the one core actor in the coming future. And on the margins of the core will be the big ones, the US and the UK. If we look at publication counts, what we do understand, however, is that as long as international collaboration rates are low in China and are predicted to remain low in China, the West still will still have an epistemic um, from a highly Marxist framework, a capitalistic dominance over other countries. And this is because most journals are still owned by Western countries. And most collaborations are or in collaborations. So one collab or X collaborates with Y. These are still with Western these are still internal collaborations on a regional level. So by that I mean that X is a British scholar who collaborates with Y, who is a German scholar. As long as this stays the same and we can see no significant trend changes in this one, the academic knowledge production as a more holistic, epistemic, and sociological field will stay the same. But if you look at purely computational and empirical data, we can see that the quant is changing. However, the meaning and the substance of what this change entails does not change too much. What Demeter and his colleagues propose in this regard is that ChatGPT may begin to lower traditional barriers. It's important to use very sophisticated language here. No one really knows as to who uses ChatGPT. The detection tools are subpar, to be honest. If you put in your respective nations' constitutions into zero GPT or other detectors, they will say that they were AI generated for your information. So these are not very good. Um, However, Demeter proposes in some way that I proposed in my earlier paper is that some parts of this very complex interplay of what constitutes the Western academic culture to be more dominant than other fields, especially with regard to language and the uneven distribution of open access, this may be changed with AI. The question is this, however. And I do wonder about this, and I do know that Jens Peter Andersen at the University of Aarhus is doing excellent research on this one, is whether this linguistic equity that ChatGPT may entail in the long run is a good thing. Just look at paper abstracts from 2025. You will definitely see words like nuanced, underscored, the complex interplay that I just used. Um, it's a question of whether it's linguistic sophistication or making nuances, or whether it will become a stylistic gatekeeping in English language publishing, where they will definitely target specific words and look at it and will say, oh, well, it was generated or worked on with ChatGPT, so we'll not accept it. For it is happening in some way in the US from my experience. For example, in philosophical journals and humanities journals, they're highly skeptical about your paper being published there if you use terms that are very AI or scream AI in some way, shape, or form. Again, this does not recreate the already existing dominance, but it does make you question as to how a non-English scholar could break into core journals if even distillistic things that he or she or they get assisted with are being checked and gate kept. So a few takeaways. Um, Again, these are more general takeaways that Demeter proposed, as the technological access and capability are not evenly distributed. Of course, the two great centers are in the US and China, which can be correlated, not from a causal standpoint, with the counts and document counts in Scopus as well. The big question is, and what we are trying to figure out right now with our future research venues, is whether more advanced LLMs that are developed by Western nations, will they have some sort of effect on the already existing core periphery knowledge production system? Again, this is a qualitative work because there is absolutely zero way to use quantitative data on this. We looked at in this paper on different um, data sets that predicted or measured AI use in academic papers. The differences were so large that they're practically unusable or create extreme subjective bias if you rely on one particular data set that is being proposed. So I think more research needs to be done on this with more computational background. I do know that colleagues at MIT are doing this, and PubMed, which is similar to Scopus, more on the life sciences and human sciences side, has been analyzed, and it showed a great peak of ChatGPT use, especially with regard to abstracts in the last 2 years. Then again, the reliability of this data is still questionable. I think it's the best thus far, and it showed that around 60 or 70% of abstracts are have some sort of trace of AI in them. Again, this is still very, very large. Um, and these are just takeaways from the data. So what we predict is that China is projected to continue its exponential growth or even boom and be the most productive actor in academic knowledge production by far, almost doubling or doubling in the outpacing tempo the US and the UK's numbers. Um, but what remains a huge question, and I think what we are trying to do right now, and it's still an ongoing project, is to contact Chinese universities and Chinese colleagues as to why the international collaboration is being so low. It does not really make sense. All empirical and quantitative data shows that international collaboration does correlate with higher impact, higher visibility, and higher citations. So it's a question of whether it's an internal policy, a gentleman's agreement even, or what is happening behind the stagnating international collaboration rates. Yeah. So a concluding thought that Martin asked me to convey is that the academic world system, if you use Wallerstein's framework, is still deeply stratified, but it's evolving, and we are living in an interesting time where we are experiencing this change hands-on. The question is whether how we as peripheral actors can contribute to this change. Seemingly, we are not big players in this game. Still, we do suppose that in some way, AI can help, at least from a linguistic standpoint, and I'm being super conservative, peripheral scholars. Let me show a few research that I'm working on. And if you are interested, I'm always looking for co-authors. We are looking at AI policies from a more socio-semantic standpoint. So we are creating word maps, networks, similarity measures as to how similar different publishers' AI policies are. What are the key aspects? And we are currently working on a data set of around 100,000 sentences where we analyzed the top 50 publishers' AI policies, and we'll compare it to the accessible Chinese policies as well. So again, if you're interested, contact me or write me in the chat, and I will be happy to pick up contact if it's just of interest to you. I think we're doing state-of-the-art research in this regard, and we are able to publish, hopefully, these papers at rather good venues. I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will just stop recording.